welcome to Talking Churchill. I'm Warren Dockter, and joining me is Professor Richard Toye from the University of Exeter. And as you can probably tell, we're recording today's episode during the hottest day of the summer so far. And the summer heat reminds us of a summer 75 years ago when Winston Churchill was faced with one of his most difficult decisions.
Since the collapse of France, this empire stands alone, but it won't be the first time. The spirit that built Britain into the greatest empire in the world is still with us to keep it so.
So, as you can tell, Churchill was very popular in the summer of 1940. However, during the summer, France had capitulated, and it left Churchill with a very difficult decision. He could either trust the promise that had been made to Vichy France and to the French that their navy would not be used for German war aims, despite the fact that we know that the Nazis had in fact broken this promise on numerous occasions to other states what they'd conquered, or Britain could take it upon themselves to destroy the French fleet, or at least remove it from service. As we know, Churchill ordered the British fleet to follow the French fleet where they had met at Mers al-Kabir in French Algeria, where they were stationed at their base. And on July 3rd, 1940, the British Navy opened fire and scuttled the French fleet, or the majority of the French fleet. And as a result, around 1,300 French sailors died. And the next day, Churchill gave a speech justifying his actions, explaining his actions to the House of Commons. And it's one of those amazing speeches which you've probably never heard of. And that's actually the topic of today's Talking Churchill, is this speech that we've never really heard of. So, Richard, could you just talk a little bit more about why perhaps we've not heard more about Churchill's speech about the sinking of the French fleet?
Well, I think that we haven't heard more about the speech for a variety of reasons. First of all, this was not a speech that Churchill recorded or broadcast at the time or later, so there aren't the clips to play on documentaries and so forth. Secondly, this is not really an event that we celebrate. In some ways we do celebrate the retreat from Dunkirk, for example, which was certainly no victory, but this is perhaps sort of a difficult or awkward, very, very awkward moment in Anglo-French relations, which the French are very upset about still in some ways, so that we don't sort of tend to sort of drag up these difficult past events.
I think that's very interesting, Richard, but what do you think made the speech so effective to the House of Commons?
Well, I think that what Churchill did very, very effectively was to outline and detail the sequence of decision making that had led up to the attack, and he laid everything out in a very sort of plain and clear way, so there weren't any particularly flowery phrases. Again, perhaps another reason why we haven't heard of the speech, but he narrated this story in an incredibly gripping manner, and it was this which clearly had a very powerful effect on the MPs who were present.
Of course, your recent book, The Roar of the Lion, the true story of Churchill's wartime speeches, examines this kind of thing. But what do you think, I mean, how did the British public react to Churchill's speech?
Well, it's difficult to separate out the reception of the speech from the way in which the British people reacted to the events that it described. Nevertheless, they were very positive, really. Pretty much everybody was positive, and so in my book, The Roar of the Lion, I've often emphasized that Churchill's speeches often provoke more criticism and controversy than we would be led to expect. However, this wasn't one of these occasions. Pretty much everybody in Britain thought that this was a good decision, and morale was boosted because at last the British, having been on the back foot for so long, were in fact doing something, even if it was attacking the French, their former ally, rather than the Germans directly.
I suppose even moving beyond that, we have to consider what the French view of this was. I mean, the French must have been resentful, and in fact, are probably still very resentful. There are stories occasionally where French sailors who had survived the incident referred to Churchill as a war criminal. I mean, what do you think the reaction was in France, or even Vichy France?
Well, indeed, the French view of 1940 is very different from the British one, and at the time, the Vichy regime was able to portray the British as a perfidious, treacherous former ally who had, in their portrayal, that the British had run away at Dunkirk, and that wasn't a heroic retreat from their point of view, and were now demonstrating yet again, their lack of trustworthiness.
Well, what do you think the sort of political dimension that Churchill was dealing with in the House of Commons when he was giving this speech?
Politically, this was a very important speech because you've got to remember that at this time Churchill was not in fact leader of the Conservative Party. Neville Chamberlain was still in the cabinet and was the leader of the Conservative Party. And it's often said that for the first several weeks that Churchill was Prime Minister, actually the cheers from the Labour side were much stronger than the cheers from the Conservative side. Now that changes on this occasion because Conservatives stand up and wave their order papers and are very enthusiastic. Churchill, very moved by his own speech, sort of sits down with his head in his hand and weeps tears because this has been a sort of very painful and difficult decision for him. Now there's some evidence that powerful reaction by Conservative MPs was to some degree orchestrated by the Conservative Chief Whip, David Margeson, but nonetheless witnesses certainly testified that this was a incredibly impressive speech. And one observer from the gallery, Lord Harmsworth, who had been a Liberal MP, wrote in his diary that he had never witnessed such a tense atmosphere in the House of Commons since Redwood Grey's speech at the declaration of World War I in 1914.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you for giving us a moment of your summer to listen to Talking Churchill. Please stay tuned for another podcast. Thank you so much.